In the winter fog of London, 1974, inside a dimly lit studio, where the air smelled of cigarette ash and broken promises, George Harrison sat alone, his guitar resting against his chest like a confession he could no longer speak. Hours earlier, he had performed in front of thousands, bathed in golden lights, the world calling him the quiet Beatle, the mystic, the calm. But behind that serene glow lived a man, haunted by voices that cut deeper than any critic, a husband losing his wife to his closest friend, an artist silenced inside the greatest band on earth, and a wounded soul drowning in cocaine and morphine-laced remedies that were never meant for healing. The glamour shimmered. The darkness whispered louder. Some say the breaking point came when he heard the words no man should ever hear, "I'm in love with your wife." Others believe it began long before, in a childhood home where approval was rare and silence was a weapon. Tonight, we descend into the shadows he never escaped. This is the untold truth of George Harrison. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. George Harrison's childhood wounds, emotional fractures, and the silent storms that shaped his destiny. Long before the screaming crowds, before the Beatlemania hysteria tore through continents, before fame wrapped itself around him like a golden trap, George Harrison lived in a world far quieter, yet far more dangerous to the heart. He grew up in a small brick house in Wavertree, Liverpool, where winter winds rattled the loose windows and conversations inside the home rarely rose above a murmur. It was a house of practical people, of worn coats and long shifts, of parents who valued silence more than softness. And for the boy who would one day be called the quiet Beatle, that silence was not a personality trait, it was a survival method. His father, Harold, was not cruel, but he carried the heaviness of a man born into the working class grind, stern, restrained, emotionally economical. Praise was a luxury he never learned to give. Affection was something implied, never spoken aloud. For a young George, every unsaid word was a verdict. Every withheld smile felt like a confirmation that he simply had not done enough. Music would become his escape, but in these years, it was merely a flicker, a thought he barely dared to believe in. His mother, Louise, was warm in presence but cautious in spirit. She loved her children, yet her love came laced with warnings, doubts, and the shadows of fear. Whenever George whispered dreams of guitars and stages, she reminded him of proper jobs, as if ambition were a dangerous flame that could burn everything down. She didn't intend to wound him. She wanted him safe. But her fear said more than her words ever could. You cannot rely on your dreams. You cannot trust the world to care for you. Mine, I. And so the boy learned a lesson that would haunt him throughout his life. Love comes with conditions, and approval must be earned. Being the youngest child made this lesson even sharper. His siblings were older, louder, more certain. George moved through the house almost invisibly. Decisions were made without him. Conversations flowed above him. He became the child who listened from doorways, who watched expressions rather than hearing explanations. Invisibility grew familiar, so familiar that later, inside the Beatles, when his voice was drowned out by Lennon and McCartney, it felt less like a new wound and more like an old bruise being pressed again. At school, things weren't softer. George wasn't the strongest nor the most confident. Teachers dismissed his quietness as passivity. Classmates joked about his small size and shy manner. It was around this time he began carrying a sense of otherness, a belief that he lived slightly out of sync with the rest of the world. He became fascinated with sound, not just music, but the way vibration could change atmosphere, how a single note could transform a room's energy. While others played games, George watched the sky, listened to the hum of buses passing, traced rhythm in the tapping of rain against windows. By the age of 12, something inside him shifted. Music wasn't simply an interest anymore, it was a language he felt destined to speak. But even this awakening was shadowed. When he first told his parents he wanted a guitar, their reactions were complicated. Half amusement, half disapproval. "Music is fine," Louise said, "but don't think it will feed you." Every dream he expressed seemed to be met with a quiet but firm restraint. Ambition made people nervous. Passion made people suspicious. This skepticism forged a paradox in his heart. He wanted to shine, but feared what would happen if he did. He craved recognition, but flinched at the thought of being seen. The emotional vacuum of his childhood did something else to him. It made him sensitive, acutely so. He felt shifts in tone, sensed tension like changes in weather. When praised, he absorbed it intensely. When criticized, he collapsed inward. This sensitivity is what made his music luminous, but it also made the wounds of adulthood catastrophic. The world would one day know George Harrison as a spiritual seeker, a disciple of transcendence, a man searching for meaning beyond fame. But that spiritual hunger was not born in luxury or artistic curiosity. It was rooted in childhood rooms filled with silence, in a father who couldn't speak affection, in a mother who trusted fear more than hope. He was searching for someone, anyone, to tell him he was enough. The boy who had grown up invisible would spend the rest of his life trying to be heard. The boy who felt unloved would search for the divine. The boy who never received approval would join the most famous band in the world and still feel small. And that is where the seeds of his later tragedies were planted, not in fame, but in childhood shadows that never left him. The glory, the suffocation, and the brutal price George Harrison paid for belonging to the most famous band on earth. Fame did not enter George Harrison's life like a sunrise. It arrived more like a storm, loud, blinding, unpredictable, lifting him high into the air while quietly tearing pieces away. When he joined John Lennon and Paul McCartney in their growing band, he was only a boy with a guitar and an intuition sharper than his age. The others saw talent. He saw escape. Music became the first place where people looked at him not through indifference, but admiration. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. But the Beatles did something far more complicated to him than simply granting recognition. They turned his longing for validation into a global obsession. With success came attention, ravenous, endless attention. Fans screamed his name, reporters shoved microphones into his face, photographers caught every blink. Somewhere inside, the young man who once stayed silent at family dinners realized he was now part of a spectacle too bright to fully comprehend. And in that brightness, he began to disappear. John and Paul naturally dominated the creative center. They had loud voices, big ambitions, and a confidence George never developed. He admired them deeply, even loved them in the way brothers love each other uneasily, competitively, painfully. But admiration alone was not enough. His songs were often dismissed, placed on the margins, cut from albums, or politely noted and then forgotten. When he did break through with a composition, the victory felt stolen by the overshadowing machinery of Lennon-McCartney. That dynamic became a silent battlefield. Not one with shouting, but with exhaustion. Not one with punches, but with moments that eroded him slowly, like water against stone. George watched the two men in front lead the world, while he held his place behind them, The guitar, a shield, and prison in equal measure. Every rehearsal became an emotional negotiation. Every recording session became a test of patience. And yet, he endured because the music mattered more than the wound. He played fiercely, wrote quietly, waited faithfully, believing that eventually the world would listen. But the growing fame demanded sacrifices no one had warned him about. There were the obvious ones: the loss of privacy, the inability to walk down a street without chaos, the relentless travel that left him sleepless and numb. What he could never have anticipated, though, was the erosion of the inner life he cherished. The boy who once listened to rain tapping against windows now lived in hotel rooms where silence was impossible. The spiritual seeker trapped in him was suffocated by noise, cheering, chanting, laughing, begging, crying. The turning point came during their tours in America. George often described those years as thrilling, but surreal, like watching someone else live his life. Everywhere he went, he was a symbol far more than a person. Girls fainted, men shouted, crowds swarmed. There were days when he couldn't hear his own guitar over the screams, nights when he couldn't remember what city he was in, moments when the exhaustion pressed so hard he felt like a ghost wearing his own body. Fame was not a crown. It was a collar. And yet, he continued sacrificing pieces of himself because success demanded it. When he discovered Indian music and spirituality, it was like oxygen entering a suffocating room. Here was sound with intention, vibration with purpose, silence with meaning. The sitar became a doorway. Meditation became a necessity. And for a brief moment, George believed he had found something that fame couldn't corrupt. But the Beatles were not a place for quiet transformations. His interest was mocked by some reporters, misunderstood by fans, and treated with polite tolerance by his bandmates. The more he reached inward, seeking peace, the more the world tried to pull him outward. He stood between two gravitational forces: fame's hungry demands and his soul's desperate whisper for stillness. It was during the creation of Revolver and Sgt. Pepper that his talent blossomed most visibly, but the internal cost grew heavier. Songs like Within You, Without You, and Love You Too weren't just compositions. They were proclamations of a man trying to break out of a cage built from adoration. But even then, his contributions were sometimes treated like eccentric detours rather than essential pieces of the band's evolution. The internal pressure intensified in the late 1960 seconds. The Beatles' empire grew monstrous financial problems, business conflicts, egos, expectations, the toxic haze of drugs creeping through their creative sessions. George found himself lost in an environment that no longer aligned with what he valued. While John descended into chaos and Paul into control, George felt his identity dissolving into a band that had grown too large to allow individuals to breathe. He wrote songs faster, deeper, more urgently than ever before. Songs about frustration, clarity, freedom, spiritual hunger. But each time he presented one, the familiar pattern repeated. Nods, polite acknowledgement, and then the inevitable dominance of Lennon-McCartney. It wasn't malice. It was simply the gravity of their partnership. But gravity crushes what stands too close. The breaking moment came not with an explosion, but with a quiet sentence in the Let It Be sessions. I'll play whatever you want me to play. Or, I won't play at all. And quote, 70 Dad, Desire Dad. It was a surrender, and a declaration of independence rolled into one. A man at his limit. A heart finally refusing to fold any further. He walked out, Not as a dramatic gesture, simply as a necessary escape. The same boy who once slipped out of crowded rooms because he felt unseen now left the most famous band in history because he felt unseen in an entirely new way. Yet even in that departure, there was sacrifice. Leaving the Beatles meant stepping away from the very thing that had validated his existence for a decade. His entire adulthood had been defined by the band, its success, its conflicts, its shadow. Walking away meant losing the identity that fame had forced upon him. But it was the only way to reclaim the identity fame had stolen. George Harrison's rise to global fame was not a story of triumph over adversity. It was a story of a gentle spirit, swallowed by a machine too loud for him to bear, a man who paid for success with the most fragile parts of himself. And though the world saw glamour, applause, and unimaginable cultural impact, the truth underneath was far darker. To be a Beatle, he had to sacrifice the parts of himself he valued most. Love as salvation. Love as poison. And the betrayal that shattered George Harrison's last illusions. For a man who spent his childhood searching for affection in silent rooms, love was never just romance. For George Harrison, it was a doorway. A promise of safety. A chance to finally be chosen. When Pattie Boyd entered his life, she didn't arrive quietly. She entered like a beam of light slicing through the chaos of fame, a presence so radiant that even the exhaustion of Beatlemania seemed to dissolve around her. George fell not gradually, but completely. Pattie wasn't simply beautiful. She carried a softness he had never experienced at home, a warmth that felt like the approval he'd been deprived of for so long. In the early years, she adored his sensitivity. He adored her attention. They were both young, unprepared, and swept into a world that devoured innocence for entertainment. Their marriage glittered on the surface photographs of sunlit afternoons in Surrey, elegant parties, glamorous travels, the world imagining they were living a perfect rock and roll fairy tale. But behind closed doors, the cracks began forming, almost immediately. George's spiritual awakening, his deepening devotion to meditation, to Indian music, to the search for transcendence was something Pattie admired but never fully understood. And as his spiritual path expanded, Pattie began feeling like a shadow in her own home. She would later describe nights of sitting alone while George chanted, or of watching him drift into emotional distances she could not reach. But the truth was more complicated. George wanted enlightenment, but he also wanted control. The more he felt spiritually elevated, the more he expected the world, including Pattie, to orbit around him. His perfectionism grew razor sharp. His temper darkened. His emotional intensity, once charming, became unpredictable. He could be tender at sunrise and cutting by noon, serene in meditation yet cold at the dinner table. Pattie, unused to such contradictions, felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Then came the touring years, the drugs, the sleeplessness, the stress. George's patience, already stretched by the internal wars within the Beatles, thinned dangerously. He sought validation in the attention of other women. Pattie later revealed that he became distant not because he didn't love her, but because he loved himself least, when fame distorted him. His affairs weren't signs of desire, they were signs of a man running from himself. Still, nothing prepared her for the day she discovered the most devastating betrayal of all. George's affair with Maureen Starkey, Ringo Starr's wife. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a drunken mistake. It was a deliberate collapse of boundaries inside their inner circle. Pattie described feeling as though the world had turned inside out, that the two marriages she trusted, hers and her closest friends, had been shattered at once. Ringo confronted them. The band's tight brotherhood, already fragile, tore further. George apologized, but the emotional damage had scorched every thread of intimacy left between him and Patty. The affair with Maureen didn't end their marriage. It hollowed it. What remained afterward was a house filled with polite conversations, locked doors, unspoken grievances, and two people pretending silence was a solution. But fate had another cruelty waiting. Eric Clapton, George's closest friend, musical collaborator, and confidant, fell in love with Patty Boyd. Not subtly. Not quietly. He descended into obsession with a ferocity that stunned everyone around them. He wrote, "Layla, the eternal cry of a man begging for the impossible." He told George to his face, not once, but openly, "I'm in love with your wife." Is inatomost to build, and I think of vistas for morning. It was not a confession. It was a detonation. For George, the betrayal was double-edged. He had betrayed Patty first with Maureen. Yes. He knew it. He regretted it. He carried shame. But this new wound felt different. This was the one place where he had always felt genuinely chosen, his marriage, and now even that foundation was cracking beneath him. He tried to hold things together. He tried to forgive. He tried to act above the humiliation. But the emotional atmosphere in their home had become radioactive. Every room carried the ghosts of choices they both wished they hadn't made. Every silence felt like punishment. Patty later recalled dinners where George wouldn't look at her, mornings where she'd catch him staring at the floor as if trying to find a version of himself he had lost. Clapton continued to pursue her relentlessly. He descended into heroin, waiting for her to leave George. Patty felt torn, guilty, terrified, flattered, confused, trapped between two men whose lives were unraveling in different directions. And George, instead of fighting for her, retreated deeper into the spiritual realm. Meditation became escape. Chanting became armor. His home filled with monks, sitars, incense, smoke, prayers, and strangers seeking enlightenment. Patty watched it with equal parts admiration and heartbreak. She wanted a husband. She got a guru. She wanted partnership. She got philosophy. She wanted love. She got distance. Then, one night, during a moment now infamous in their history, George turned to Patty, his voice eerily calm, and said something that broke the remaining thread between them. "Let's just accept that we're not meant for each other anymore." Is inatomost to build, and I think of vistas for morning. There was no shouting. No melodrama. Just resignation. A quiet conclusion to a love once too bright for either of them to carry. Patty left him. She walked not toward freedom, but toward the man who had refused to stop loving her, even when it destroyed him, Eric Clapton. The world painted the story in tabloids as scandal, chaos, rock star decadence. But the truth was quieter and far more tragic. George Harrison lost the woman he loved, the woman he betrayed, and the woman he had hoped would save him from his own emotional shadows. He lost her to his friend. He lost her to fate. He lost her, ultimately, because he had never healed the wounds that made him need her so desperately in the first place. The marriage ended, but its echo followed him for the rest of his life, into new relationships, into his music, into his spiraling search for spiritual purity. Even years later, when asked about her, he would answer with a gentleness that revealed the truth he never said aloud. He had loved her more than he knew how to show. And he had broken her exactly the way he had once been broken. The tragedy was complete. The climax was sealed. Illness, denial, violence, spiritual desperation, and the truth George Harrison spent a lifetime escaping. Even after the collapse of his marriage and the implosion of the Beatles, George Harrison tried to build a new life out of the wreckage. But the truth was far darker than the serene photos that circulated in magazines. Behind every smile lay a man unraveling slowly and privately, holding his pain with the same delicacy he once held his guitar. The world liked to believe that George had finally found peace in gardening, in meditation, in spiritual retreats, in the quiet countryside of Friar Park. But serenity was not a constant for him. It was a mask, and beneath it lived storms that never fully settled. His descent did not come as a dramatic collapse. It came as a series of small surrenders, to exhaustion, to illness, to substances that promised clarity but delivered confusion. The illness he tried to outrun. George's body began sending warnings long before he acknowledged them. The years of smoking, chain smoking, by some accounts began carving damage into his lungs. It wasn't glamorous, or dramatic, or mystical. It was slow, relentless, invisible. The coughs grew sharper. The fatigue hit harder. The days of boundless energy became a memory. He tried to hide it, even from himself. He told friends it was just a chest thing, the residue of travel and touring. But scans told a truth he could no longer escape. Cancer, first in the throat, then later metastasizing to the lungs, and ultimately the brain. Where most people panic, George spiritualized. He convinced himself that chanting would purify the body, that faith could rewrite diagnosis, that transcendence was stronger than cells dividing in the dark. For a man who spent his life escaping emotion, illness became another battlefield he refused to face directly. Still, he fought in silence. Chemotherapy stole his strength. Radiation carved its toll across his frame. Yet he continued to speak in terms of karma, dharma, rebirth. He told one friend, "I'm not afraid of death. It's just like changing clothes." And with Thetid. But the truth, the unspoken truth, was that he feared leaving things unfinished. Songs unwritten, apologies unsaid, wounds unhealed. A violent night that shattered his final illusions. The moment that broke him didn't come from his body but from an intruder. The 30th of December, 1999. A night that would become legend. A man named Michael Abram, delusional, convinced that God ordered him to kill Harrison, broke into Friar Park armed with a knife. George heard the glass shatter downstairs. His instincts told him to protect his home, his wife, his sanctuary. He confronted the intruder with nothing but courage and bare hands. It was the last heroic act of his life. Abram lunged at him with a knife. Olivia screamed. The attack was vicious, personal, deranged. The blade pierced George's chest, collapsing a lung, missing his heart by inches. Blood soaked into the antique carpets he cherished. He fought back with what little strength he had, but the damage was done. The physical recovery took months. The psychological recovery never happened. George had always believed the world was chaotic, but this night proved something worse. Even in your own home, you are not safe. He became paranoid, withdrawn, hyper-aware of noise, of shadows, of strangers. He installed new security, more cameras, more locks. But no lock can silence the memory of being hunted. The attack aged him years in a matter of days. substances, spiritual bypassing, and the man who couldn't sit with pain. In the 1,970 seconds, George flirted heavily with cocaine, alcohol, and medication more than the public ever knew. Patty Boyd later described his usage as excessive, turning his emotions rigid, his compassion thin, his sense of reality distorted. These years formed scars inside him that would never fully heal. Though he later stepped away from hard drugs, the psychological dependency, the belief that something external could soothe an internal crisis, never fully disappeared. He clung to spirituality with the desperation of a man drowning. Meditation became not a path to enlightenment, but an escape hatch from a world he didn't know how to live in. When doctors told him the cancer had returned, he responded not with fear, but with a kind of numb acceptance. He had always romanticized death as transcendence, but now that it approached, he found himself wrestling with something he had never allowed himself to feel fully: regret. Regret for Patty. Regret for the friendships that soured. Regret for words he should have said to Paul, to John, to Ringo. Regret for time wasted on anger. Regret for hiding behind mysticism instead of confronting his wounds. The confessions he never intended to make public. In private moments near the end, he made several raw admissions, small fragments of truth spoken to close friends and family. They were not grand confessions. They were tired whispers. To a friend, shortly before entering treatment again, I spent years trying to rise above everything. But maybe I should have learned how to be in the world instead of leaving it all the time. I would everything's prized. To his doctor, after another wave of pain, I thought I could outrun this. I thought I could chant my way through anything. I would everything's prized. To Olivia, I wasn't always the man you deserved, but thank you for loving me anyway. I would everything's prized. And perhaps the most telling, spoken quietly while listening to one of his own early Beatles recordings, I spent so long waiting for them to hear me. I should have learned how to hear myself. I would everything's prized. These weren't rehearsed statements. They were moments of clarity, painful, humble, and profoundly human. A legacy forged in contradictions. George Harrison's death on the 29th of November 2001 was mourned around the world. But the tragedy wasn't simply the loss of a Beatle. It was the loss of a man who spent his entire life searching for something he already had but didn't know how to hold: self-worth. His story exposes a truth society still struggles with today. Silence does not mean peace. Spirituality does not erase trauma. Fame does not fill emptiness. Illness does not purify the soul. And the deepest battles are the ones fought inside. George Harrison was a man who tried to cure emotional wounds with transcendence, who tried to heal loneliness by disappearing into philosophy, who tried to evade pain until pain carved its way into his lungs. His legacy is magnificent. Yes, the music, the films, the charity work, the spiritual influence. But the legacy that matters most is the lesson his life whispers to anyone who listens. If you never confront the shadows of your childhood, they will follow you into every room, every relationship, every success, and even into the final breath of your life. George Harrison didn't die defeated. He died human. And sometimes, that is the bravest ending of all.